Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruth Frazier, and I'm the training coordinator for Evergreen, Indiana. Welcome to this first Training Tuesday for the Evergreen, Indiana Library Consortium, covering genres and subject headings. This webinar is being recorded, and a YouTube link will be provided in the follow-up email you receive. This email will also include your LAU certificate as well as a link to Jocelyn's slides. If there are individuals watching this webinar who have not registered, please make sure to send their name or your name, the library, and email address to all panelists in the chat window. That will send it to me so I can make sure to get that follow-up email sent to you. There will be time for questions and answers during the second half of today's webinar, so feel free to put those questions into the chat window, or you can use the Q&A feature with Zoom. To send messages to everyone, please make sure to select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down. Today, we are pleased to introduce Jocelyn Lewis from the Indiana State Library. Jocelyn has been a cataloger with the State Library for around 10 years and is the supervisor for the cataloging department. She has been cataloging in Evergreen, Indiana since the beginning of the consortium and is an active member of the cataloging committee.
Okay, everyone should be seeing the first slide of my screen. Welcome. Thanks for attending what I believe is the very first Training Tuesday presentation, also known as the presentations we would have given if we'd had Evergreen Indiana Annual, but didn't because everything just got really weird in the world. So we're trying to still provide that content to you since we couldn't have the in-person meeting. So thank you for attending. I wanted to do a presentation on genre and subject headings for several reasons. Just as you all know, as we work in the catalog, we see problems crop up, and some of these problems kind of seem to be happening over and over again. Also, since we have authority control with Marchive, every time we periodically will send out records to Marchive, and then they will compare our subject headings and genre headings against the Library of Congress lists, and then it spits back a report to us with everything that couldn't be matched up. So there are some things in those reports that I've noticed that are really probably just require some refreshers, a little bit of training to remind people about genre and subject headings and how they're supposed to work. Also, as I was working through this, I started to get really philosophical on the whole concept of genre and subject headings. You know, why do we do this? Who are we doing this for? Does this work for our patrons, for us? So the first half of this presentation, I'm going to wax a little philosophical about the subject. Maybe, encourage people to look at them from a different way, I guess. And then the second half of the presentation, I will actually be showing examples from the catalog of some of the problems that I've seen or that have been brought to my attention that aren't major problems, but do need to be cleaned up a little bit. So the main goal is to keep things from showing up on that Marchive report that comes back to us, because then someone has to go through and clean those up by hand. So we're going to start at the very, very basic beginning, and we're going to talk about the difference between subject and genre headings. So a subject heading describes what the item is about, and a genre heading describes what the item is. So I've got several examples lined up, excuse me, to go over. The first is The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. And these subject headings and genre headings are taken directly from our catalog. So they're from Evergreen, Indiana. What is it about? It's about honeymoons and man-woman relationships, which that is one of the worst subject headings, I think, in all of subject headingdom. It could mean so many different things. We all know it's kind of code for a romantic relationship, but I mean, if you just look at these subject headings, who's to say this isn't a book about a man and a woman who murder each other on their honeymoon? That's not what this book is about. it is romance fiction and humorous fiction. So these combined kind of give you a sense of what this book is. It's about honeymoons and a man and a woman. It is romance fiction, humorous fiction. Here's a nonfiction example. What is it about? It's about Winston Churchill in Great Britain during the Second World War. Again, the subject heading World War 1939 to 1945. That's not how people really would go in and search for World War II if they're looking for information on World War II in their catalogs. So it's not really a natural language usage, but that is the authorized heading for World War II. And what is it? At best, it's biographies is really the only genre you could use for it. So genre terms aren't going to apply to nonfiction that much. So if you see a bunch of genre terms listed on a nonfiction item, I would look very closely at them. Here's Polaris Rising by Jessie Mihalik. What's it about? It's about runaway women, life on other planets, soldiers. What is it? It is science fiction, it is romance fiction, and it also has a genre heading of space operas. So space operas, does that mean anything to the average user? I know what it means, and we're actually going to look at it later on. But it's kind of a very specific subgenre of science fiction that is probably going to be mainly familiar to people who are into that kind of thing. And here we have What We Do in the Shadows, the complete first season, which has been my favorite thing to watch during this pandemic. What is it about? It's about vampires who are roommates who live in Staten Island. And what is it? It's a television comedy. It's a vampire television program, which is a very, very specific genre heading that actually exists. And because it's about vampires, you could say it's a fantasy television program. You could also make an argument that it's a horror television program. So there are actually a lot of options you can do for genres, especially with AV type materials. So why do we worry about these? Well, the main benefit is that if we properly use them, they will collate everything with that heading together. So if a patron is interested in other materials on a topic, they're easier to locate in the catalog. So here's the space operas example. This is everything in Evergreen that has a genre heading of space operas. We have 105 titles. So if someone really liked a book and that was one of the genre headings, you could click on it and see what other books we have in the consortium that also have that genre title. So it's a reminder that we want people to use Library of Congress subject headings, and those are available at the authorities.loc.gov. I'm sure you all know that site. We prefer Library of Congress genre headings, which is the LCGFT. The PDF for that is down here at the very bottom. So it's a PDF, it's 100 pages long. You can use Control F within it and search around and look for genre headings that might be interesting or to figure out what they mean. So this is a sample from the LCGFT list, and this is the one for space operas. So you see they have them divided by form. So there's space operas for comics, space operas fiction, and space operas motion pictures. So genres are defined right underneath, but those definitions can be really ambiguous. So for space operas, those are defined as large-scale action and adventure fiction involving space travel. So basically, Star Wars. Underneath it, you'll have like the cross-referencing. The UF is used for, BT is broader term, RT is related term. So under space operas, you use for space operas is now, used to be the heading, now you have to have the fiction in parentheses behind it. So the book that I showed you earlier was under an older heading. You also use the term space operas for space travel fiction, which I think is probably a more natural language way of saying what it is and a term that everyone would understand. And down here you can see we have spaghetti westerns, and this one is a very specific subgenre of westerns in general, and it's defined as western films usually produced or co-produced by Italian companies and filmed in Europe. And the use for it, there are a lot of different ways of saying spaghetti westerns I've never heard of, including paella westerns. Kind of interesting. So this is where you go to see how they define things and also what you're supposed to use for certain terms. So in this instance, you can't use space travel fiction as a genre term. It needs to be space operas fiction. And as a warning, there are some things that like sensationalist fiction shows up on this list, and that is only to be used with certain Victorian novels. So not all of the terms are going to be applicable to books that we're cataloging. And unfortunately, a lot of very useful terms are nowhere to be found in the LCGFT, or really in any other thesaurus. So one that's not in there is romantic comedy fiction, but romantic comedy films is an approved term. LGBTQ plus pretty much anything. There are genre terms that are broken down by like lesbian fiction, gay fiction, etc. But there's no like overall broader genre term for that. Manga is also not in there. We know that that is a completely different subset of the comics and graphic novels. Amish fiction is not a genre. It's something that we put in as a subject heading. So your Beverly Lewis novels are going to say Amish subfield V fiction, but there's no genre for Amish fiction, even though we all know that is a particular kind of genre, right? There are books about Amish people that aren't like the Beverly Lewis books. And so someone who wants to read nothing but books like Beverly Lewis isn't going to want to be sent home with a book such as, there was a book that came out last year called Women Talking, which was about sexual abuse. It was within a Mennonite community, not an Amish community, but still, it has the same basic Amish fiction subject heading as the Beverly Lewis books, but those are two totally different things. Contemporary fiction. Enemies to lovers fiction. These are both common tags on GoodReads, which I'm going to get into later on in the presentation. Historical and detective mystery fiction. So right now what we have separate genre headings. So we have like a detective and mystery fiction genre heading and then a historical fiction genre heading, but there's nothing that combines things together. So if you're a patron and you want to read something that has both of those genres, there's no way to like click on two genres at once to see everything else that has both of those genres. So it's much more helpful if these can be compiled together into one, and then it's a more specific kind of genre. And I think it's more helpful to the patrons at the end. So what are some terms that you wish were available that whenever you catalog, it drives you crazy that you can't use it? And while you think about that, I will talk about how at the State Library, we have the Talking Books program, which uses a completely separate system called CLOS. And CLOS basically picks out books for patrons based on their reading interests. So patrons let us know they like reading romance novels, but they don't want any sex, they don't want any language, they like historical ones. So our librarians spend a lot of time making up genres to make sure that our books are very, very specifically tagged so that we can send out the correct things to our patrons. So they basically try to use the Library of Congress headings, but they're just so restrictive that they end up needing to make up their own. For example, they had to make up their own Amish fiction as a genre. So they wouldn't send out books about Amish that had violence and swearing and sex in it. I'm not sure how many of those there really are, but there probably are some. So genres are really very important, and I think can be very helpful to patrons. I don't know that our ILSs really make great use of them. I think library systems could be better at how we can use them, but I'll get into that more a little bit later. So, caveat, if you happen to be cataloging a pile of heavy metal CDs, the LCGFT has got you more than covered. It's kind of hilarious looking through it. There's a lot of music and AV genres because when they started doing this, those were the areas they were focusing on. So no, we can't have romantic fiction as a genre, but you know, we've got sludge metal. So if Melvin CD, you're good to go. But there are so many more practical genres that it's kind of hilarious. I mean, this is a really pretty thorough listing of heavy metal and the subgenres. So it's funny that you have all of these options for something that not many of us collect, and so few options for things that we all collect. So just so if you're doing music or if you're doing movies, the LCGFT is great. It's got a lot of very specific genres for you to use, but for regular books, it's lacking. So that's not your only option for controlled vocabulary for genre terms. You do have others. So if the Library of Congress doesn't have it and you want to use another thesaurus, that is totally okay to do. However, it absolutely must be coded correctly with the controlled vocabulary defined in the subfield 2. So here are some examples of ones that, I frequently use. I have a 655, it's second indicator 7 for panoramic photographs. And since it's got a second indicator 7, it needs to be defined in a subfield 2. And in this one, it's AAT, which stands for the Art and Architecture Thesaurus. And then here's another one using a different thesaurus. It's protest posters, and the subfield 2 is GMGPC, and that is the code for the Thesaurus of Graphic Materials. So when you see headings like this, don't delete them. They may not be useful to you, but they are to other institutions. So basically, if you see something that is defined in the subfield 2 and there's a code behind it, it's okay. Just leave it alone. Of course, there is an exception to that rule. You can go ahead and delete anything that has a subfield 2 that says local, and even if it's a legitimate heading otherwise. So for example, you might see a record that has a 655 subfield 7 book club shelf. These are more than likely records that are coming in from other libraries. So if you're importing things through Z3950 or through Bookware, you're bringing in records directly from another library, and those libraries have their own policies and procedures. They might have their own locally defined rules for what can go in fields. So this is one that you definitely want to delete out of the record, because this is for another library's deal. It's not for our deal. If you have a situation where there's an authorized heading that's got the subfield 2 local, you can change it to an authorized heading if necessary. Usually when I notice those, it's a duplicate field and there's already a valid 655 field in another part of the record. So like I said, watch out for these when you're bringing in records from other libraries, because again, they're not neutral records, like OCLC has this concept of the neutral master record, which I find a lot of stuff in OCLC records I need to delete. But these are records that are cataloged to other library specifications. So you need to be on the lookout for some locally defined things in those records. So if you know what your options are, you can go to the Library of Congress, and they have, there's two sections. There's one for subject headings, and these are, for subject headings, you need to use these sparingly. Subject headings should generally be Library of Congress, but some of these thesauri include genre terms. So the art and architecture thesaurus, which I use frequently, is in the subject headings because it's got both, but I mainly just use it for the genre terms. And then there's a whole other section for the genre terms. And it also gives you the code source, so you know what to code in that subfield too. It's also good if you're like curious, you bring in a record and it's got some other controlled vocabulary use in it, and you're curious as to what it is, you can look it up by the code and see what it is and see if it's legit. So next I'm going to talk about BICS headings. I know there was a bit of an issue with BICS headings being deleted from records. And I know they look so weird and awkward. And when they first started showing up in records, I thought, oh my gosh, what are these? These look awful. But the more I play around with them, the more I think they're kind of neat, and they're kind of more useful than some of the more traditional headings we use. So, like I said, you're going to increasingly see these, particularly for newer and popular materials. BICS, it's a controlled vocabulary put out by the Book Industry Study Group, and it's available online for free. You can look at it and play around with it. So basically, this is how, it's kind of like a classification scheme and subject and genre headings all rolled into one. So it kind of lays out for book retail how books are organized, like within a store. But it, in a lot of ways, mirrors what we already do with like Dewey and LC and our subject headings. It just kind of rolls everything together. And I will say that I really think BICS as being more genre-like, but it does go in a 650 field. And again, it's defined, it's got a subfield for second indicator 7, and then a subfield 2, which is defined with BICS. So here's an example of a nonfiction one, which is true crime, which is the broader category. That's where the book would be in the store. And then murder, which is like the subcategory, and then mass murder, which is like an even more specific subcategory. So you got to get all your mass murderers together and keep them away from, you know, one-off murderers. Comics and graphic novels, they have manga as a completely different genre, like a subgenre. And then within manga, they have a whole bunch of different genres. So this one, they have one called Magical Girl, which sounds delightful. I really am not entirely sure what it is. It just was, oh, how delightful. This is one of my favorites. This is fiction, and then mystery and detective, and then cozy, and then culinary. And we all know exactly what kind of book this is talking about, right? These are all of those books that have punny titles with food names in them and recipes in the back. It's a definitely a subgenre of cozy mysteries, which is a subgenre of mystery and detective fiction. So if someone came in and really liked, you know, one of the series they're reading and they want to read other series, this is an easy way to get them to similar books. And they also have things for juvenile or kids books. So this one is juvenile fiction, animals, and then dragons, unicorns, and other mythical beasts. So when you see these, do not remove them from records, because some libraries are actually using these and they manually add them to records. And so if you overlay a record that has these headings, please make sure you copy and repaste them into the record. Please, please, please do not delete these. They look weird, yes. But just because they look weird doesn't mean, we should treat them as lesser subject headings.
Jocelyn, can I
Yes.
ask a couple questions
Sure.
from the audience real quick before we move on? Okay, so the first one, and this goes back to the thesauri.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon me, sometimes I can actually say the word. Is there a list of thesauri that you recommend?
It's really hard because a lot of other thesauri are for very specialized collections. So I use the art and architecture thesauri and the thesaurus. This really is hard to say.
It is.
Thesaurus for graphic materials. If you have like your local history collections, those sorts of thesauri might be helpful for you. So if you do have like a collection of photographs or artwork or something, posters, those would be helpful.
Would it be appropriate for somebody to email you if they had a question about maybe they were looking for a thesauri or a thesaurus?
That would be totally fine.
Okay, for those specialized collections.
For specialized collections, yeah, there are a bunch. There's like one that's just for bindings of books. That one actually shows up a lot in some of the things I do, and it's really annoying. I don't like them. I really don't even want them in the record, to be honest.
Fair. Okay.
So yeah, if anyone has questions about very specific sorts of special collections, feel free to ask me.
Okay. Then there is a question. You recommend using the LCGFT as the first choice for genre headings. This person sometimes uses a Library of Congress subject heading as a genre heading in a 655, and then it says _0. Is that acceptable?
Technically, they do get verified in Evergreen. Anymore, the new rule is even if it's Library of Congress, it's supposed to be a second indicator 7 with the definition and the subfield 2. So when I do a 655.0 in OCLC, it automatically changes that in the record for me. However, I've looked around in Evergreen and the 655 just plain subfield zeros are authenticating. Okay. So I think that's okay.
And then related to that is the subfield 2 for BISAC, BISACH, or is it BISACSH?
It's this one, I'm pretty sure. It's CH.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've also seen it a couple different ways, but when I look at how it's defined on the Library of Congress's list, this is how it's defined.
Okay. And then one more related to BISAC. Does Evergreen collate BISAC headings in the same way as well as it does the LCA?
It does. Yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
Okay.
Hold on.
That's what I have for the time being. As I say, I think that we might be getting notifications.
I have Teams turned off.
I know. So just in case you guys are wondering what's going on, because we both work for Indiana State Library, there's a staff meeting that we're not attending right now, and so all of a sudden we're getting notifications because everybody's joining it. But I can't hear it in your computer, and you probably can't hear it in mine. So.
Okay. Are you seeing it though?
No.
Oh, okay.
Nope.
Okay.
It's just showing up on our computers.
Okay.
Bye, Courtney.
So annoying.
And Paula.
Okay. Were there any other questions?
Nope, that's it. So, oh, wait, I see that. I've seen BISACH in the subfield 2. Should that be corrected to the BISACHSH? Jennifer, I'm gonna say, without even having Jocelyn say anything, that doesn't have to be corrected because they're both appearing. So
yeah, like I said, I've seen them in different ways. but I'll double check. I don't think, I know they collate because I've seen the BICS headings and it'll show like we have 100 things with that BICS heading next to it. So they're collating. I will look closer into the subfill too for the BICS, because I'm really, one of the points of this is I want people to love BICS and think that it's useful. So I will look into that and I will get back to everyone and send out an email on the listserv afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we're still on BICS. So I want to show what it looks like in our catalog. So we have an example here of a YA book. And as you can see, we've got a couple of BICS headings. And yeah, this one has the CSH. I might have just written it down wrong. Again, I'll get back to you at the end of this. So the headings for this are young adult fiction, romance, and then romantic comedy. See, we can have a romantic comedy as a heading. Contemporary, and then clean and wholesome, which I don't know how I feel about that terminology, but I do notice it's being used a lot. I know Thorndike now has a whole like clean reads line of books that they put out in large print, and I've seen the word clean used a lot on GoodReads, and it's kind of if you like say want to read a romantic story but you don't want to spend like an entire chapter reading about like heaving bosoms and stuff, but you don't want to read like religious fiction either, this is kind of like a new like genre of romance that doesn't have untoward stuff in it, I guess. So that combined with the regular subject headings of high school students, teenagers, fast food restaurants, that really gives you a good idea of what kind of book it is. Now, there's a 650 of chick lit in here, and chick lit is actually, it's an authorized subject. It's not an authorized genre. So it has been authorized within our authority file. It's not about chick lit. Again, this is the subject versus genre, what's it about versus what it is. Also, the scope note for chick lit, according to the Library of Congress, specifies that the work be about women in their 20s and 30s, and this is about high school students. So it's not really that, but I kind of get where they would get that as a heading. It's basically like beginner's chick lit, or I guess you could say it was chick lit, get it? But it really doesn't belong in this record. However, it authorized against our file because it is a legit subject heading, not a genre heading. So it's not going to show up on my report. So it's not the worst thing in the world. Here's another book. And this one, we have headings of contemporary women, humorous, and then romance contemporary. And this one actually does have chick lit as a 655. So it has it as a genre, but it's not, I can't find it as a genre in any controlled vocabulary. It's not a term even in BICS. It's a term that's kind of loaded and has, some people embrace it, some people hate it. But it's a word that a lot of people use. So GoodReads earlier, and if you don't know how GoodReads work, it's kind of a place where you read books and then you can put them on shelves, and you can basically you can create your own like genres and labels and tags for them. And so what's neat about GoodReads is that it compiles everything and shows you the top terms people have used to describe books. And so of this over 17,000 people who have shelved this book, and the top lists of terms that people have used consistently, chick lit is really high. And then contemporary romance is high. And then I mentioned earlier, enemies to lovers is really high. So almost 700 people picked those exact 3 words to describe this book, which I think is really interesting to see how people describe the books they read and how it's different than how we as librarians describe the books they read. And
I have a question here
sure.
about can we go back to the record page real quickly?
Sure.
But since the second indicator is 0, and this is referring to Chicklet being in the 655,
Right.
since the second indicator is 0, doesn't that mean it's in the LCSH thesaurus?
That means someone thought it was in the LCSH
right.
Thesaurus. So there's no subfield 0 afterwards. That means it's a non-authorized heading. Marchive couldn't match it to anything.
Good to know. Okay.
So you can put a 0 after anything, or before
right.
anything. Doesn't mean it's going to be authorized.
It's an example of a bad entry.
It is. And again, I think this is something that probably came in from another library, and they made a local decision that we're going to use Chicklet as a genre, and we're just going to put it in as a second indicator 0.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, I don't disagree. Like, I think that's how people, it's a term people use to describe it. So if I saw this, on an unmatched Marchive heading, I'm not going to roll my eyes at it.
Right. So then down record, and there is this another question over here that's related to that. Do you want us to use the second indicator 7 and not 0, and then use a subfield 2 as the go-to? And that is indicated down 2 lines down then, with Chicklet being there. And then
it's a fast heading. Those are auto added by OCLC. And I think because Chicklet is an actual subject heading, that's why it got the 655 fast. Because it's not in the Library of Congress subject headings. So
if somebody is doing this manually, is your preference for it to be the indicator 7, second indicator, and then the subfield 2 as they're doing that?
I mean, that's how OCLC does everything now.
Okay.
Like I said, whenever I just do a 655-0, even if it's a legit heading, it auto changes it to show a second indicator 7 and then the subfield 2. And that's a rule that I think changed. I was reading the documentation, maybe it hasn't even been 10 years, maybe 2011. So there was some concerns about systems authorizing things and being confused. So they recommend that you use the subfield 7 and then define it.
Okay. And I will include the, actually, I'm just going to probably shorten it, and I'll put a link to the cataloging procedures that deal with this as well. They are a little bit ambiguous in some ways, and I think that is necessary because of our shared catalog. So
sure. I mean, but like I said, I did check in, having it as a 655-0 does authorize, as long as it's an actual authorized term, and Chicklet is not. So that's why it doesn't have the subfield 0.
Right. So Misty, I guess the answer is, if you know that it's an authorized heading, you've checked it, then you can just do it still as the second indicator is 0. But if it's not, then 7 and then subfield 2 to define it. And then there's a question. So if a 655 second indicator 0 is changed to a 655 second indicator 7, is it okay to put LCSH in the subfield 0?
No, leave the subfield 0s alone. Evergreen will automatically...
I'm sorry, subfield 2.
No, the LCSH is the subject headings. So the genres are, you would use LCGFT.
Okay.
Is the code for that.
And do they need to do that, or is that part of the authorities that it's going to check against the thesauri and add that automatically?
It doesn't add it automatically like it
Okay.
does in OCLC, but if it's already in our thesaurus, it will append it with a subfield 0.
Okay.
With the Evergreen authority record that it's referencing.
Monica, does that answer that fine. Accurately for you? Accurately enough for you? Okay, fantastic. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, so GoodReads is a really good place to go to if you're wanting to get better genre terms. In all honesty, whenever I read something I like and I want to read something similar, I go to GoodReads. I don't go to our catalog. But I think our catalog could be a lot more useful because we are putting in a lot of the same information that the people are putting into GoodReads. We're just a little off on what they call things. And we're kind of really strict on what we want to call things. And I don't know, it's just something that, to think about. I will say that, not everyone uses the exact same terms. For example, most people use enemies to lovers, but some people use hate to love. So you see that over here. But it's just kind of something to think about. Like, do the terms that we use to describe things, are they really what your average library user uses to describe things? And can we be better? So just something to think about.
I think that and this is just me thinking philosophically at this point too, that there has in librarianship been a shift, and I don't know when this happened, but when there was this first move to cataloging things back in the Stone Ages or whenever that was, that it was more for doing this for librarians. And now it has shifted to access points for our patrons to yes. find their own stuff. But the language that is being used, it started out and there was just no consideration for real language, really.
Right.
And now that has changed, and so there is a need for us as a profession to change, and it's been slow.
It has been slow, but it's definitely things to think about. And I've thought a lot about it. Like I said, the first part of this is going to be philosophical, and this is kind
right.
of what I'm getting at.
Right.
But this is kind of why when I played around with BICS, I started to be like, this is actually getting more to like a natural language. So the next example they have fiction coming of age, which is what Bildungsromans means. Like, did anyone know what that was before they started cataloging? Because I didn't. And I was an English major for a while as a younger me. So no one is looking for Bildungsromans, but coming of age books for people like evolve as they grow up in their teens. Yeah. So that's just a better way of putting that makes sense to people. So even if you don't use BICS as a classification scheme and you're inspired, you can still add these headings yourself. They're really easy to go to the website and play around with them. Like I said, they combine a lot of things together. So like, sure, we can have firefighters as a subject heading, but there is a completely separate genre of romance fiction involving firefighters that people like to read. So if you think that these are going to help your patrons, feel free to add them, even if you don't use them otherwise. Or just go around and look at the site and see what's available, because I was kind of impressed and liked what I saw. Did you know that Evergreen, Indiana has its own established thesaurus for genre headings that are not included in other options? So this is a very, very new thing. We only have 2 headings in it right now. We have LGBTQIA+ fiction, and then we do create one for manga. So these are going to be second indicator 7 with a subfield 2 that says EGING. So definitely don't delete those. If you're interested in new genre headings, you can submit suggestions to the cataloging committee, and we will talk about them and probably add them. And Anna is the only person who can add to the thesaurus. So we'll announce new terms when they're approved and added. So you can't go in there and create your own controlled vocabulary, although it is very tempting to do so, but I think it's a lot harder than you'd think. So we'll see how this goes. This is just kind of a new thing we're trying.
I have another question about BICS. Do all of the parts of a BICS heading go into a subfield A?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
That's why they look awful.
Yeah, for real.
Okay, so we've got to the second part, and we're gonna go through it a little quick. These are things that I've seen in the catalog. So these are things to watch out for. And if they don't get corrected, these are definitely going to be showing up on my Marchive reports. And I'm going to show you what those reports look like later on too. So the first thing is I've noticed fields that just have dashes instead of the properly formatted subfield B. So I don't know if someone is copying and pasting into like the text editor and not going back and reformatting things, but this is definitely wrong. So either overlay it or go in, and I know the Mark editor with the web version is wonky and the cursor just kind of moves around on its own, but this is definitely something that's not going to authorize. Another thing I've seen are incomplete headings. So the headings are authorized for the subjects, but they're lacking the form subdivision. So this is actually a fiction book. So these should have a subfield B fiction, but these aren't actually going to show up on a report because these are valid subject headings. It's just, if you look at these, you'd think the book is a nonfiction book. And then again, there's another cattle drives -- fiction just hanging out there. I will say that some of these that I took screenshots for, I didn't correct, and when I went back to look at them later, someone had overlaid them. So I think a lot of these probably do get caught before they go to Marchive. But don't be the person who like puts them in, I guess, is what we're striving for. Another thing is incorrect or made up genre headings. This one's kind of a big problem. First of all, this one is Biography of Mike Pence. It has a 655 of politics. That's not a genre, that's a subject. It isn't politics, it's about politics. It is a biography, so if you're gonna have a 655, it should be biographies. You should never, ever make up genre headings. You take away one thing from that, well, two things. BICS is cool, don't make up genre headings. Yeah, you can make up subject headings. You can establish a heading for like a local church or a local business, but I can't think of any reason why you would ever want to establish a genre heading. If there's something you really want to be a genre heading, you can run it by the committee and we can see about adding it, but you can't just make up genre headings. So here's another one that has amateur sleuth mystery as a 655, and that's not an authorized term. And unfortunately, it's not a subject heading, so you couldn't like even format that into a subject heading. However, BICS totally has a heading for that. That works. So if you want something like that and BICS has it, you can go ahead and add it to the BICS headings that are already here. So it's already got historical and women's sleuths. So you can also add amateur sleuth to that. But you can't just pull the, you can't just make a BICS heading and try and force it to be a Library of Congress heading, because that's not how it works. And again, I have a feeling this is something that came in from another library system with that heading. But those are things to watch out for. Another thing I see are things that kind of repeat themselves. They're in a 650s and a 655. So this is actually for a movie. So all of these headings are really genre headings, and they're down here as genre headings, but they do, because they are valid as subject headings, they authorized against Marchive in our current file. However, they don't collate the things right. So if you click on romance films as a subject, you're going to get a completely different list of materials than if you click on it as a romance. Because see, they're referencing totally different Evergreen authority files. This one references one, ending in 2022, and then the genre ends in one ending in 2721. So I'm not entirely sure why they're in there as both. But this is for Portrait of a Lady on Fire. This movie isn't about romance films. It is a romance film. So again, difference between genre and subjects. So this is what a Marchive report looks like. This is a very, 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 very small section of the unauthorized heading report. It's just a massive text file. So these are all the headings Marchive could not match. So some of these brothers-sisters relationships, that should be brothers and sisters. Yes, for men and women, it's man-women relationships, but that just because it works for that type of relationship doesn't mean you can just do that for every other. You have to check the authority file to see how they want to say it.
Is that 7-digit number above that the database ID?
Yes, it
Okay.
is. It is. It will take you directly to it, which is very, very helpful. The next example is car repair. Sure, that is how people would say that if they came up to your reference desk. They would say, where are the car repair books? But LOC wants us to call it automobiles, maintenance and repair. So I guess we should be happy that they're not making us say horseless carriage or something like that. But again, it's another not natural language use per se. Down here we have a heading for Chevrolet Celebrity, which is a kind of car. However, the actual authorized heading for that should be Celebrity Automobile. Now, if you look up Honda Civic, it's Honda Civic Automobile. So it does have the make and model. So you don't expect there to be tons of consistency in how authorized headings are created in the Library of Congress, because sometimes there's really not. You still have to check your headings before you use them. In addition to the unmatched headings report I also get one for genre headings. And like, I've kind of mentioned before, a lot of the headings on this report are actually just subject headings that need to be a 650 instead of a 655. So here's an example. This one has a crime television feature. That should be television crime shows. Crime thrillers is not a thing. You can combine genre terms to kind of get to the same description, and that depends on if this is referring to a book or if it's referring to a movie or a TV show. And then here at the bottom, we have two headings that are definitely work as subject headings, but not as genre headings. So if they were just a 650 instead of a 655, they would be great and they would not have appeared on this list. So watch out when you're doing those. Okay, another thing I've seen is, especially with local history stuff, people kind of making a lot of headings for things that could probably be better off transcribed in a contents note field. It's really time consuming to create headings for individual entities like a cemetery. The way you would do it, the way I do it when I do a lot of local history stuff, is I have to look and see, is there a heading in Library of Congress? That's the first thing I do. If there's not, then I have to go and see, have we already established a heading locally? And if we have, then I need to use that heading to make sure it matches. And then if I have to establish a heading, then I have to make sure I'm doing it according to RDA and all the rules. So if I personally were doing this item, I probably would just put all of the cemeteries in a content note and not create individual headings for them. Now, if I had a lot of material on all of these cemeteries, maybe then I would do it. But at the end of the day, most people are doing keyword searches in our catalog. So a keyword search is going to trigger both of these records. And this one is more likely going to have issues with the headings than this. So if you're facing that kind of situation, think about how people are going to be accessing the record. And is it really necessary to have everything that the book is about be transcribed into a subject heading? Because I think that's creating a lot of work for you. And a simple content note or a 520 is probably going to do the job just as well. And finally, older materials with older records may have no subject headings. And so we want them to have at least one. That's our requirement. So you want to be on the lookout and overlay those with a better record if possible. Or you could just get rid of the item. That's always also a possibility. But I will say this book from 1987, I read during the quarantine. And I know the reason people still have it. It won the Man Booker. So it's an award-winning book. But this is still a very sad record for it.
And there's nothing to say you can't actually go into the subject headings and find something that would fit in here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's work, obviously.
Yes. But that's, when you keep older records or you keep older materials, they usually have older, not great records. And I think that's where a lot of some of the problems come from, or actually from records that migrated in.
Yeah.
So, bam, we've got 4 minutes left.
That's fantastic. And I don't actually have any lingering questions out here. Does anybody have any questions for Jocelyn before we finish up? I have a list of things here that I learned, so now I'm going to have to practice saying buildings Romans, or however you say it.
Let's just delete that from all vocabularies.
Yeah, I mean, it's
not a thing.
No, well, I mean, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. Okay, so there is one question here. Do we keep the 650 large type books heading when it's supposed to be in the 655, or do we remove the 650 and use the 655 only?
I would do the 655 only.
Okay.
I can't remember. I need to check. Does it say in our policy manual that it should be a 650? It might actually say that. I will look at that and see what it says. It should be a 655 because that's what it is.
Right. So I'll be sending out the link to that part in the procedures. It's authorized in the Evergreen, Indiana file. The 650 is, not the 655.
Okay. We'll look into that.
Britta, is that fair to say? We'll look into it. Okay, fantastic. Anything else? From anyone? If not, thank you, Jocelyn. This really was very helpful. I will be sending out follow-up emails probably this afternoon, tomorrow at the latest. It will include links to this presentation, to the recording, your LEU certificate, and whatever else we can throw in there. So, guys, have a great day, and thank you again, Jocelyn.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.